All right. So the questions we've got up in the poll that we're asking for feedback. The first is, or the question is, what's the hardest part of project recovery in your organization? The first one being getting people to acknowledge that it's even needed. The second, getting alignment on how to go about it, or creating a recovery strategy that will really help. 4, knowing whether or not recovery is actually working. And 5, ending recovery mode and getting back to normal. So the sort of the progressive stages that we would go through in a recovery situation. And so the question is, what part of that's going to be hardest in your organization? And we have about half of the people voted already, and there's a definite leaning towards the first step. So, you know, the clicks have gone because Guy is, I think, relogging and resetting and trying to fix whatever it was that was causing the tapping. So what we're going to talk about today, I'll babble on a bit whilst we wait for that and people to fill in the poll. We're going to talk about project normalization, what happens when we go through a project recovery, we come to the end of it, and we then decide how to get back to normal or perhaps terminating. So we're going to talk about the sorts of things that are going to affect how that works when we actually do that from a recovery mode, rather than what might happen with a normal project situation. So let me close this poll and share it. We have a majority of people having clicked in there now.
And while we're there, we'll say how we're going. Are we still getting clicking from me?
Yes.
All right. Well, maybe I will just sit quietly and be on hand for polls and any important questions.
I can still hear what you're saying, etc. It's just that it has the clicks on top of it. So
right,
you're still understandable. So there's the results. Wow, 57% have said that it's really all about getting it started in the first place. And it tends to get progressively easier from there, which is not surprising, I guess, but it's a big jump to even get this situation acknowledged. All right, let me give everyone a quick update on what's happening with Podoko. I'll end that poll. Now, there is in the Podoko forum, there is a survey that's been posted. And this is in the Podoko forum within the learning portal. So where you would normally find all the other things, the particular Podoko forum that's there has the survey link in it. So please jump in there, grab the survey. Even if you've only played it once or twice or done 1 or 2 things, you'll have an idea of how this concept is meant to fly. And that's what we want your feedback on. So this is not a survey about how well did it work. It's more a survey of, well, what should it become and how did that work out for you? Let me turn me on. Where am I? There I am. There's my talking head. There he is. So this is about getting some feedback from you on how we need to take this to the next level. So a lot of people already have given feedback, and I want to very much thank everyone for that. Lots of people have taken the time to give suggestions, to give pointers, to give ideas, and that's been really valuable. And we've collected all of that. We have now launched another version. We've been fixing a few little things along the way over the last week or so. We've now deployed version 1.05. And in that version, we have made it so that all 80 incidents are unlocked. So we had some issues with some people that weren't rolling over into week 2 and week 3 because it was originally meant to be divided into 4 phases with 20 incidents per phase. But in the interests of getting everyone a chance to just experience the whole thing, we've just unlocked all of it. The only side effect of that might be that now that it's all one group of 80 incidents, you might detect the odd incident that kind of sounds like it should have been later in the project. Well, that's because we've effectively removed the gates and barriers that normally would have sequenced that a little differently. So just let that slide by and go ahead and go through the incidents and see how you go with it. We are collecting a lot of feedback and ideas, and it's still possible to get in, and even if you haven't started yet, it's still possible to get in now and you'll be able to play the entire 80 incidents in the scenario. So it's not too late to get in and catch up. So I've got some quick stats that were given to me earlier this morning. From what I understand is there's almost 250 people have actually got in and played it. We have just shy of 4,000 incidents that have been resolved. So everyone's been pretty busy resolving project dilemmas. And we have 5,277 PIPs that have been listened to during the course of all that. So there's been plenty of activity. There's been some terrific input. And at this stage, what we're really asking for now is for you to spend just 5 minutes, follow the link, go to the survey, and give us your thoughts on all that. So This will continue right up until the end of the course. So next week there's the exam week, and even beyond that, another week, the Produco system will be open and operating. So you've got plenty of time if you want to play around with it some more. All right. So let's get into the discussion today about what we're doing with a recovery project that needs to normalize. It needs to come back to normal. And one of the first challenges is trying to understand, what do we mean by normal? I mean, the normal we had before, during the recovery phase, when we kicked off recovery, we had to come to some conclusions about what wasn't good enough. So the important part of going back to normal is we're not going back to normal, we're creating a new normal. So this happens at the point when the recovery strategy is actually triggered. So when we go into recovery mode, some of the things that the board will decide when giving the mandate of going into recovery mode, the board will also need to stipulate under what conditions, what thresholds, what tolerances, what parameters will exist for the project to be considered going back into a normal status. Now, it is a new normal, so you really get to reset what these requirements are. So if, for example, we had performance issues and things were late or etc., over budget, we can reset these parameters and say, okay, this is the new tolerances that we're going to consider to be acceptable. And if we get within those, then we're going to consider this project to be going back into a clean status. But it's more than just meeting these tolerances on a one-off. This is not simply a case of saying, well, we just need to see it now. To be able to see any of these, we need to have a recovery strategy that has measurable targets. We need to have things in place that make it possible to objectively know whether or not we're actually achieving any of these things. So when we talked about the strategies before, we talked about, well, what do we do if we've got a business justification problem? Well, that means we're going to need in our strategy, what we discussed is we need a much tighter sequence between the steps of the process to do with scope, output, and value. So we are checking the justification of that on a much more regular basis, in a much more detailed way, with closer and tighter communications. We need a way to report on that. So we need a way to demonstrate to the board that says, yes, this kind of close circle of feedback loop that is helping us understand that the business justification is still valid, we need to demonstrate that in a recovering project to have any chance of saying, well, actually, maybe we're not recovering anymore, maybe we've recovered. So similarly, if we've got performance issues, and we talked before about performance with the project often being due to inability to see all the information, we need to be able to show that that is now consistently performed. So everything we're going to use must be measurable. But it's more than simply saying that it's okay today. If you remember when we talked about the point at which a project goes red, when we say a project is going red, we said that not only was it outside of tolerances now, we said that it also did not have enough faith or confidence that it would be able to go back into a green status by itself with current methods. So it was a case of us having lost confidence that the project could be recovered with existing methods, so we came along with a bigger hammer. That was called recovery mode. So when we go into recovery mode and we want to have an end date, we need similarly to have this confidence change that not only do we have good tolerances reported now in our project, but that we have enough in place to justify our confidence that it's going to continue to stay in that good green status before we can unshackle the elements that we put around it that we called recovery mode. So before we can deconstruct that, we've got to be confident that we're not going to need that suddenly again next quarter or next report. So it's not about this one report, although that's obviously a very encouraging sign. It's about all of the future expected reports. And one of the reasons for this is that when we go into recovery mode, we may have really taken an axe to the project. We may have changed so much of what the project is doing and how it's doing it that it's immediately in the green on a spreadsheet. It may be that we've cut the scope, we've thrown in more budget, or we've done some drastic things in recovery strategies that says, well, right now, immediately, it's okay. But the question is, will it stay like that? And that comes back to the question of what caused it to go red? What caused it to go into that state in the first place? And how are the protections and the guards against that, how is that working? And do we expect that to continue to work? And you need a track record of that before you can really know. So this means that it does come back still to looking at the nature of the problem. What caused it to go red? So when we are looking at, and when the board, the project board, is looking to decide, well, how are we going to know when we should normalize this? You're looking at the business justification issues. They're going to want to know that they can see a clear, tighter relationship between the sequence of scope, output, benefits, and value. So if we can see a tight loop between these and it's consistent and it looks predictable, then maybe we're ready to go normal from that point of view. If we're looking at leadership interference, well, we need to see evidence that change control is working more effectively and that impact on anything that's affecting the project is being effectively recorded and dealt with and discussed and managed, and that ultimately from that, risk management for interference in particular is being handled properly. Because this is what we talked about in the recovery strategy as being the things that we're going to use to deal with interference-related problems. If it's performance related, well, that's again a little more simple as it was in the recovery strategy. We need to see the reports that show what's really going on and the trends and predictions that show that it's going to be okay. And culturally, culture is a harder one to measure. If we're looking at culture, then the main thing within a project reporting context that we look at is the risk register, because really the most effective, or sometimes even the only place we can record culture within a project and its effect on the project is in the risk register. So if the risk register is saying, well, we have a morale risk, or we have a perception risk, or we have a branding risk, and what could that cause and how could that affect things, then that's what you need to see in the risk register. You need to see that up to date, and you need to see that working in a way that we're pretty confident that we're able to deal with the risks that come from cultural related issues, if that's what we're dealing with. Our poll came back. Gonna get rid of that. So, do you remember this? I'll put this whole slide up. We talked about this last week. Whoops, there we go. This is the evolutionary stages that occurred before we went into recovery mode. Right, so this is the 4 stages. Here's what it looks like when you have all of the stages up. I'm not sure if this is actually, I'll put them all up. I hope you can read those. I'll read them out to you. So the first 4 is what we already talked about. The next 3 are the 3 other stages of the project recovery. So there's strategize, which is where we define and confirm the recovery strategy that's needed. Then there's the execution of that strategy, which is the ongoing delivery of the project in its heightened state of awareness, which is effectively, if you want to break down recovery execution into a single statement of what is it really, it is a heightened state of awareness about everything to do with the project, but in particular about the things that were perceived to be a threat to the project. That's really what it is in a nutshell. And the entire strategy is about exactly how we define that awareness and how do we create it, how do we use it, how do we react to it, but that's really what it is. But then you've got the final step, which is either to normalize the project or terminate the project, which is at some point we end recovery mode, and we end it in usually one of these 2 directions. So when we look at going into a normal state, if we're coming out of recovery, what kinds of things might change? Well, this is going to be influenced based on what we had to do when we actually went into recovery mode. So when we went into recovery mode, there were people change. So we probably changed leadership. We probably put in a recovery project manager. When we exit recovery mode, there's a case for saying, well, this recovery manager who was put in with specific skills, specific attributes, and for a specific reason, they are associated with that recovery status. And quite possibly they conducted their business in a way that reflected the situation that they and that project was in. And that may not be something that you want to have as an ongoing status quo. But usually if you're going to step out of recovery and the recovery manager might move on, you want the new project manager, if they're going to take over, to step up from within the recovery team. So usually you'd structure the recovery strategy to say, right, Fred is going to be the new recovery project manager, and Mary's going to step in as Fred's deputy in this situation, and Mary's going to be the one that will take over when Fred steps out. And that's planned right from the beginning of the recovery phase. So you're not going to bring the old project manager back, but you're going to have someone ready to step into that shoes who knows what their responsibility is going to be, and they're going to be the project manager at that point. We probably changed reporting. We probably introduced a whole bunch of new reporting. Some of that will ease off. We might have gone a little bit heavy. Remember I talked about it a moment ago, heightened state of awareness. There's going to be a point at which some of this reporting, this extra oversight, is no longer necessary. We've gained the confidence, the predictability that the system is working. We might not need all of the extra governance and the checks and balances that make absolutely sure. We might have changed the goals. Now, if we've changed the goals, these things will stay. So we might have altered the scope. We might have altered what the project was for. We might have altered some of the business benefits that it was aiming for. But those things are now part of the new scope of the project. These things will continue. And lastly, anything extra that we put in place to protect it against whatever we decided or felt were the reasons why the project failed or was failing or went red, those things need to stay. Because unless you can clearly, confidently say that the original source, the root cause of those problems has now changed or gone, then we need to make sure that these protections are in place. But we also need to make sure that when we're normalizing that we're not too focused just on one thing that went wrong last time and leave our project vulnerable to something else that might still pop up in the future. Now, you can go normal on a gradual basis. And this is what I think is the most common. It's typical. Gradual incremental normalization is where things become more normal bit by bit. They are recognized bit by bit as becoming normal as we get closer and closer, perhaps getting closer to being within tolerances or being within tolerances on an ongoing basis where confidence increases. So we're acknowledging and notifying everyone that things are getting better. But if we do have an incremental normalization, again, these milestones are usually set when the recovery strategy is mandated. So when we have the board say, right, here's the recovery strategy, we're approving this, and here's the milestones. Here's the thresholds you have to reach for incremental recovery. Now, incremental recovery, you might talk about it in terms of percentages. You know, you might say it's 20, 40, 60, 80, 100%. You might talk about it in colors. You might say, well, it's red. Next stage will be orange. Next stage will be yellow. Next stage will be green, which is the system that I use, except I don't call it green. Green projects are ones that never needed recovery. So recovered projects, I call them blue. Now, blue is as good as green, but blue just keeps everyone reminded that this project got some special treatment, had a bit of a problem, and is still having some oversight, some care and attention to that sort of problem. So it says that, you know, we're still keeping an eye on those things. It's still a little bit different. But we want to be able to celebrate the successful journey of a project that is normalizing. We want to be able to say, this is getting better, and we want to share the joy and the happiness that comes from that. But at the same time, we need to keep some of the interest that is protecting the project and giving it that extra level of power and authority that comes from the fact that it's still in recovery mode to some extent. So we gradually ease it out of one perception into a slightly new perception over time. But this can be different depending on whether we're doing it from inside the project or from outside the project. So you could have a situation where how it's perceived within the project team might be a little different to how it's perceived from those that are outside the project. And how we present this and what we make the biggest noise about could be different between the two. So let's look at the two different elements. Let's look at internal normalization. What this does is it's mainly for the benefit of the team, the project team, and it lets them know that they're being successful, that the board has more trust in what they're doing, that has confidence in the project, that confidence is growing. So it helps build morale. It helps people feel a greater sense of buy-in, that this project is really going to stay, it's going to stick around. You know, it's passing its tests. So therefore, it's something that we can now feel confident to invest in either directly or emotionally or physically in some way that supports the project. It also means that whilst we're incrementally improving, if you have a little bit of a setback, if you have a month where the numbers are going in the wrong direction briefly, you're not suddenly having to say, oh, hang on, we're all back in recovery mode now. Because if we're still moving, you can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back as a normal part of an ongoing incremental recovery. So it gives you a little bit more leeway for the back and forth that might happen with the reporting. But it also means that we avoid this sense that people feel that, oh, look, it's going to be in recovery mode forever. And recovery mode is a drag and it's going to be difficult to get it through. But this could be different from the external perspective. And I'll cover the external perspective and then I'll see if we've got any other questions. I notice we've got one question pop up there now. So I'll pause for questions at the end of this next slide. So external normalization has some different purposes. When we are wanting people outside of the project to think of this project as becoming normal, we're showing all of the stakeholders that by the measurements that the board feels are important, this project is increasing in its success. It's becoming more successful. It also shows people even outside of those stakeholders. So this could be the public, it could be our customers, our suppliers, it could be anyone outside of the organization, that we show them that this project has momentum, it's going to do good things. It could be that the shareholders are waiting to see its impact. It could be that our competitors are looking to see, are we really going to do this or are we going to give up on it? And this allows us to use this kind of announcement to say, this is getting stronger. So it means that we're not having the big fanfare where we put a stake in the ground and say, all right, yesterday it was terrible, today it's great. We're having a normalization strategy that says we are improving gradually, but we control how and when those messages come out. So we get to decide when we talk about the fact that it's becoming normal or it's getting better or it's becoming successful. And it helps the stakeholders to know that whatever we're doing, like when we have a recovery strategy, there's usually some discomfort amongst some stakeholders. Some people are less happy with it. So those that are happy with it, we get to say, well, look, this is working. And those that are not happy with it, we just say, well, yeah, see, it is working. So it also means that we're validating the business strategy. And that's often an important thing, to ensure that the business strategy is being implemented successfully is a very important thing for the organization, both internally and externally, but particularly externally, to say that the people who run this company have got their act together and they know where they're going and they're on their way. It's happening. The company is going in a strategic direction and it's justified in what it's doing. The point is, if we don't make some effort to have an external perspective on how this project is progressing and normalizing, then that message will shape itself by word of mouth, by gossip, by assumption. All those other mechanisms will come into play and will tell the story for us, or maybe not the story we want to tell. Let me pause and grab a question. The question from here, so how do you thwart those who broke the original project by insisting on scope creep from insisting on scope creep during recovery? So that would be very much under the category of leadership interference. And that means that if that's the problem, and we recognized that when we went into a recovery mode, then we would have implemented quite a different kind of change control regime. And the point about recovery mode is that we are allowed to have what might otherwise be considered a very onerous and painful change control regime. We might be allowed to say, well, we're going to be really unusually, painfully tough on change control and controlling scope creep. Why? Because we've identified that was a serious threat, an existential threat to the project. So we're now pushing back to such an extreme extent that we are expecting and hoping that these new regimes will control that kind of scope creep and change. But that probably isn't sustainable. So the idea of going out of recovery mode is to say, well, we have these perhaps severe and draconian change control measures that we're now adhering to quite strictly, but there's an overhead cost to that. There's a problem with that. But if we see that those who were causing these sort of problems at that time are now responding and handling things differently, then maybe coming out of recovery, we can start to ease up on some of those and have a more practical approach to it. So change control form pre-stamped with a no. Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I've seen change control enter a freeze where we say, right, we've just been through a recovery strategy. We've just listened to everyone. All you scope creeps, come out with your whatever you want to change. We'll hear you. The project board will hold court, and whatever you have to say, and then whatever we decide now, that's it for the next however many months. Don't come crawling back with more issues later. It's not going to happen. So yeah, you can literally have, all right, let's stop and check. Right, here's the new scope. We're going to lock it in for 6 months. Zero change policy. I have seen that happen. Did it work? Well, kinda. But if it goes on too long, it can create other problems. So that's what happens and coming out of recovery into a normalization process. What if we're going to terminate the project? Or what if there's some kind of termination? What if it's the other kind of ending? Well, just like with recovery mode, the project board at the recovery strategy mandate will be determining, okay, under what conditions are we likely to terminate this project? And they may even pre-decide what kind of termination may be appropriate. But that's subject to change. But this is what the board will be saying at the recovery phase. We'll be saying, right, here's all the things we're going to do. Here's all the things we're going to do differently. Here's all the thresholds that will tell us that the project is recovering and doing well. And here's the thresholds that will tell us that maybe we should reconsider cancelling this in part or in full. So that all gets decided at the point where the recovery is taken up, so that there's no arbitrary thing later where the board comes along and says, you know what, we changed our mind. We don't feel like it today. We're going to close it down. Now, they can still do that. They are the project board. But the idea is to give some degree of predictability to the people that are in the project to say, well, we know the left and right-hand side of this channel that we're in. And we know if we're getting too close to one side or the other, we know what we need to do about it. So this means that you can have incremental normalization, or you could have incrementally movement towards termination. So if things are continuing to go towards a negative status, where it's continuing to stay red and the confidence isn't there and it's not improving and it's not solving its problems, then you might have an incremental winding down or an incremental closure. Termination doesn't suddenly mean that on one day everyone says, right, you can all go home now, we're done. It quite often happens over a period of time. It can take a significant portion of the amount of time that the project would have taken. It can take at least 10% of the project's initial planned duration. It can often take 20% and sometimes even more to effectively wind down a project, depending on how drastic the change is and what's going to happen with everything. So it can take a fair bit of time. So what we can't do, though, is as a project board or as project leadership, we don't want to really try and have it both ways. We're either moving towards normalization or we're moving towards possible termination. And we can hold our cards close to our chest, but we don't want to create this seesaw effect amongst the people involved, because this could be very damaging to morale. If we're talking about normalizing one week and the next week we're talking about terminating and then the next week we're talking about normalizing, we will do a lot of morale damage in that situation. And we may end up causing termination because people leave, the people we need to keep. So that's something to be aware of and be very worried about. We don't want to let that happen. But when we talk about termination, usually there's this big conflict between what should really be a financial discussion and financial considerations and what ends up being emotional decisions. Now, when it comes to the financial considerations of do we cancel or terminate a project, there's three really big ones that, in my experience, tend to take over most of the conversations. One is the sunk cost. And this is the perception that, we've already spent so much money on this. We don't want to waste that money. We've got to do something. Something's better than nothing. Let's salvage this investment and get something out of it, which is where more money gets thrown at something in order to turn it into some kind of return on investment. So there's this idea that, you put in X amount of money and you kind of got to put in some more to get some of that back. That's essentially the gambler's myth. But then you've got the opportunity cost, which is the question of saying, well, if we do continue to put more money into this, we may get that value back out of it. We'll get something, we're trying to recover the sunk cost. So we put a bit more in, and this is what we'll get out of it. But that bit more that we put in, if we put that somewhere else, maybe we'll get even more value. It's no longer a question of what do we get for the money we've already sunk. The question is, what do we get for the money that we're going to have to add in now to top it up? The third point, which is often becomes a bit of a myth, is the idea of the full realization cost. So when people are talking about and evaluating things, a lot of people fall into a trap of evaluating components. So they measure the cost of something based purely on its cost of creation, the cost of delivery. What we need to look at is the full cost of gaining value from benefits. Now, value is step 3 in the process. By that, I mean, you've got outcomes, which is the first step, which is what a project will deliver. And that outcome needs to result in benefits. And those benefits then need to yield value. So value is the third piece of the puzzle. Too many people get stuck in focusing on just outcomes. We have these outcomes, and therefore it's going to be great, therefore we should spend the money. So this is the mantra that we need to think about if we're looking at a termination scenario. And this is, of course, relevant whether we're terminating from a normal project or from a recovering project. Only benefits have value. Outcomes only have costs. Outcomes are just something we create. Until we can leverage that into benefits, and those benefits have real value, then the outcome has no value. Which means the money that we would spend to achieve that outcome might not have any value unless it delivers benefits that can be leveraged. And it's the leveraging part. So what happens is people get stuck in this hypothetical idea of saying, well, if we build it, they will come. If we have this thing, of course it'll be great. It sounds great. I think it'll be great. But that extra step is the leveraging of those benefits. They look like benefits until you say, well, how is that going to be something that we can turn into something successful? And often at the end of the day, it's going to come down to how does this add to company equity, share price, or future success? Now, I see there's a few questions that have popped up. Let's pause and tackle some of those. James is asking, how do we bring down the heightened emotional connection of people to a project to enable successful recovery? So part of what this has just covered is trying to do exactly that. And you're asking the question of how do you do this? I'm just talking about what the problem is. How do you do it? There's two parts to this problem. There are some people for whom you cannot help them see this. Their life, their mind, their world doesn't work in a sufficiently big picture perspective that they're going to be able to fully grasp all of the things. This is one of the reasons why different people have different responsibilities and why the project board exists, because the project board have the accountability for the implementation of the strategy. And so they have the unequivocal requirement to operate within the big picture. Not that they always do, but that's where that requirement lives. So we have to acknowledge that not everyone will see the forest for the trees, but how do we make those people see it? It's about discussing the difference between benefits and value. So I would suggest you focus on the leveraging of benefits into value. Have that discussion, have it as thoroughly and as completely as you can. Because in my experience, when people get emotional about stuff, they're emotional about the outcome of the project. And they take a leap of logic that that outcome leads to benefits, which leads to value. That's the leap of logic that you can work on to try to help them understand that that ain't so obvious or not as straightforward as they think it is. So that's where I'd suggest you tackle that particular point. Let's look at Matthew's question. If a project went red, wasn't decided to cancel or salvage, then when a recovery strategy, it could still be terminated. Wouldn't that be a decision before it went into recovery normalization? Couldn't termination almost be redundant if all other things were done right? I think I understand what you're saying. It's when you go into recovery mode, yes, you could have a situation where the project will either recover or might still be terminated. The assumption is you're only going to go into recovery mode if you have sufficient confidence that recovery mode and all of the things that you will put with it will result in a successful normalization of the project. So you're probably less likely to go into recovery mode if you think that termination is still the most likely outcome. So I think if you're honest enough to say, well, one result or the other is likely to be inevitable, it doesn't mean you can completely ignore the other. I mean, I've seen project recovery that's operated with a real cultural battle. And the way they've overcome or tackled the cultural battle is to use the threat of termination as a way of reminding people that it could be worse. And the project was never going to be terminated. And there were a handful of people in that situation that knew there's no way this is going to get terminated. But the vast majority of people were never quite sure whether or not that was going to happen. And so the discussion about it could still be terminated, that kept popping up now and again. And it was used as a way of helping strengthen or sugarcoat the pill, not sugarcoat, I guess it's a stick, not a carrot approach, to all the things that needed to happen during the recovery to give the project its best chance to succeed. Let me know, Matthew, if I haven't quite answered that question. I'll look at the next question. In case it is a long-term project, and if it's not doing good in the middle, project board decide to terminate, what will happen to the half miles development okay, so what happens to the little bits and pieces that if you're halfway through? I'm actually going to cover that in a few moments. The next couple of slides should address that. Let me just check the other question. Will sunk cost help in the remaining part of the project to be completed? If you have parts of the project that continue, then those parts of the project might leverage that sunk cost. So let's talk about that in more detail, okay? Let's look at the three different kinds of termination that we're going to address here. So the imaginary termination, which is not really a termination. This is just where you dress it up in new clothing. You change the names, you change the labels, you change the face, but the vast majority of what's going on may continue to go on. And this is mostly to change the branding, to change the perspective, to make people think it's quite a different project. And that can be to do with project reputation. It can do with a lot of emotional and cultural issues might have been wrapped around the terminology and the perception of what this project is. And part of the way of solving that is to, well, let's just perceive it as something very different. But if you have a partial termination, which is I think what the recent questions are talking about, you have a partial termination where some big pieces of the project may continue in some form and other pieces of it will just end. Now, in making the decision of what continues, again, it's tempting to say, well, let's keep the bits where we've spent the most money. That's not the right approach. The approach should be, let's keep the bits that are going to give us the best value if we spend more money. So the question then is, if we can leverage some of what these pieces of the project are going to result in and leverage those into benefits and value, then those are the pieces of the project that might continue in some form. And how that happens is all very unique, and it depends. Things get absorbed into other projects, things get moved into other departments, things get spun off into self-contained little projects, etc. Exactly how that happens is not really the important part. The important part is, which bits do we keep? How do we protect those and give those pieces of the project a better chance of success because we've ditched something else? And how do we make sure that we're not continuing in those pieces that we keep, that we're not taking all of the existing problems with us? Then you have the complete termination, is where, well, There's nothing left. The whole thing is considered a dead end, and we're going to turn it all off. Let's look at these in a little more detail. The imaginary termination is we're just changing appearances. A large portion of it, if not all of it, is going to still be there. It's just going to look different and be called different. So this often happens for reasons where perspective makes a big difference. It could be for branding exercises, public reputation. It could be anything to do with how things are perceived. It's often a political solution to a practical problem, or it's a practical solution to a political problem. And it can occur at the boundary, the joint between political and practical requirements. It might be impractical to close a project, but somebody politically powerful is yelling and screaming and getting their way and causing a lot of trouble. We say, oh, we're going to close this project. We're going to open this other one up. Oh, it's totally different. No, it's really different. It's not the same. Don't worry about that. We've all seen that sort of thing happen, I suspect. But the reality is, unless that happens really cleverly, there's a good chance that whatever plagued the problem the first time has got a chance of following it. This is not a fix. This is papering over it. So this is what can happen, and I have seen this happen when it's screaming out for a recovery strategy, and instead it just gets a rebranding. But the problems stay there, and later it's even worse. Doesn't solve its problems. So partial termination, people will start to fight and argue over what gets salvaged and what gets cancelled. So you find that you then get stakeholders arguing, debating, you get politics involved, you get a lot of posturing going on where people are trying to get their piece preserved. The idea and the role of the project board is to preserve the value. And this is where it goes back to the question that was asked before. How do you get people to let go of the fact that they're trying to cling to their piece of the project? You have the value and benefits discussion. You don't talk about the outcomes or the results, the output of the project. You say, well, okay, let's look at how we're going to leverage that into benefits and what's that going to cost. Because it's not just a case of saying, well, we're going to spend this money to create this outcome. That's just project cost. We build the outcome. It may be that we can no longer leverage that into something useful. It also means you have people within the project, part of the project team, that are worried about what are they going to do next week. People will be scrambling for the parachutes, some people will want to jump early. And you need to be careful that pieces of the project that you might want to have continue get threatened because the people in it, they weren't sure that they were going to have a job next week. So they've bailed and gone somewhere else to do something else. So you need to keep the people informed and up to date. And it's not really acceptable, or it's not really cool to say to people, oh, look, you've all got a job, don't worry, just because you don't want them to all rush and leave, because that'll come back and bite you as well. That'll affect next time you need to get people into a project and have them trust you. It also means that there's this assumption that there'll be more resources freed up. If we stop investing in this to some extent, oh, maybe there's going to be some funding now for what I want to do, my pet project. And that's where resources get fought over. People say, no, don't give it to him because I have a better plan. He messed up the last one, etc. Whoops. But whatever pieces of the puzzle we keep, whatever problems were affecting those, may persist and continues. Total termination. Now, we've talked a bit about the emotional barriers to termination. The bigger the scale of termination, the more people are going to be somewhat depressed about it. So the more morale we need to deal with, the more astutely we need to respond, the more correctly and quickly we need to respond to the issue of morale. As a people manager and as someone who's been involved working with people, and to me, the most satisfying part of being in a team is helping the people in the team. The very first conversation I want to have is what will happen to the people. Because the company will look after itself. The strategy will look after itself. The board will look after all of that. The first and most important question is, what's going to happen to the people? Let's get as many answers to that as we can and keep them informed. Because the people are the most important asset that's going to determine what's going to happen with your next project. There'll be a lot of potential wastage on the table. People are going to say, well, how can we salvage this? There'll be sunk costs. Somebody will say, well, I've got a cool, innovative idea for how we can use that sunk cost with a tiny little bit of investment and do something with it. These conversations are now taking place. Remember, people don't just get repurposed. It's a terrible phrase. Things get repurposed. People do not. People need to be able to step forward. So this is the hard part when project teams disintegrate, is helping people move onwards and upwards or move somewhere into something that they're happy with. You get recriminations, you get a lot of blame going on. Or why did this happen? Whose fault was it? Who takes political advantage of this? And everyone's covering their back. But this comes from the question of how do we get into this place? When we terminate a project that's coming out of recovery, the point is we know all this already. We've had these discussions, or we should have, and we should have had them thoroughly enough that we now know what's going on. So we need to make sure that we've already captured the lessons learned. Regardless of how we terminate a project, we should already know what we should be doing next time. But if we do suffer the pain of a full termination of the project, we really want to make sure that we've learned these lessons and carried them forward as best we can. Let's look at the last question. Do imaginary terminations rescope and retender? No, not in my experience. Imaginary terminations don't undergo a lot of real change. And rescoping and retendering is a real change. If it's rescoping and retendering, that to me is more like a true recovery process. I did see on one occasion where, and actually I thought this was kind of clever in hindsight. It felt pretty rough at the time and poorly handled, but in reality, I think it kind of worked out. This is where there was real animosity towards the idea of project recovery. It's like, it was very much an ego thing. Oh, my projects don't fail. They can't fail. This department, we don't have that problem. And however, they did in reality. And everyone knew they did. Well, people who were honest about it knew they did. So the solution was they did in practical terms what you would have probably called a recovery strategy. And it looked and smelt just like a recovery, but they just called it a rebranding. They never used the word recovery. They did reshape the project. They put more checks and balances on some things. They put more robust protections on things. They did what you'd expect in a recovery situation. They just didn't call it that. It gave it some other fancy name and said, oh, we've just now canceled that. We've rolled a few things into this new project and we're going to do it a bit differently. Well, yes, that's because you got burnt last time. And lots of people saw that as being a bit fake and a bit see-through and a bit artificial. But hey, it got through that pain. It got to the other side. And we ended up with a reasonably successful project. And we even managed to save the ego of someone who probably didn't deserve it. So let's win all round. So it can happen like that. Let's have a last poll before we wrap up with any last questions. This is a topic question. Can we launch the poll? Can I launch the poll?
Yeah, sorry. When I jumped out, I made you primary host, so you can launch the poll, or you can make me host in the participant section, or co-host.
So if I click polls, it just pops up the old poll.
Yeah. If you click poll,
I'm going to stop sharing results.
Stop sharing results, and if you go to the top, there should be a drop-down box. And week 4, poll 2.
Week 4, poll 2. There we go.
How's the audio, by the way? I suspect it was my headset before doing the clicking, so it might just be poor audio with no clicking now.
Clicking's gone.
Great.
You are clickless. No more clicks. All right. So this is to help us understand, to help me understand which of these topics was the most interesting for all of you. So whilst you're filling that in, I'm going to advance the slide to the topic 4 summary because we're wrapping up now.
Well, whilst you're doing that, sorry, Brenton, can you make me a co-host?
Yeah. Where do I do that?
Please, just if you open participants.
More make co-host.
Thank you.
Did that work?
Yep, I'll look after the poll from now.
You have user power now.
Yep.
So It looks like the big winner is topic 3, which is great. I definitely try to put some of the most interesting stuff in week 3. The topic 4 summary, there it is. This is what we covered this week. What else we want to talk about? Oh, the forum activity, the last forum piece for topic 4. So what this question is about is consider a project, a troubled project. Did it end up being terminated, or should it have been terminated? And would a formal recovery phase, remembering all the things that we talked about, that if you terminate a project, a lot of it is already figured out at the recovery phase. Like what really caused it, why are we in this trouble, what lessons do we need to learn, what's the thresholds for termination, what pieces might we keep, how would we terminate it if we did? A lot of that gets worked out in the recovery discussion. So the question is, a project that should it have been terminated or did it, and what impact would have or did have, if it actually had that, would a recovery phase have done? So we can be hypothetical. You know, a project might have been terminated, and what would a recovery phase have done, or if it maybe it actually happened. Or obviously comment on someone else's thoughts. Do we share the results of the poll? Are they sharing for everybody now?
Should be sharing now.
Should be sharing now. Yeah, there it is. Right.
Topic 3, very popular. A couple of comments saying, oh, they enjoyed all of them, would like to choose more than one. And one comment saying that they've really enjoyed topic 4, but learnt more in the first 3.
Right. Cool. Okay. There's going to be well, there's 2 surveys, right? There's the survey for Produco for everyone that did that to help the Produco team learn from your feedback. But there's also, Guy, there's going to be something from IT Masters as well. Is that right?
That's right. We'll cover that on the final slide, I think. Well, I'll have a few minutes and chat about the exam and
final slide.
We are at the final slide. All right. Well, I'll stop sharing the poll results now. If there's anything you want to talk about briefly before I'll jump into the exam discussion, and then I'll throw back to you to end the course.
And then if there's any other questions that have popped up in the meantime, I'll answer them then before we wrap up.
Beauty. All right. Well, I guess the most important thing for the purposes of the short course is that there's going to be an exam released later this week. I expect Friday. I'll release it once I'm in the office. This is just to gain the course certificate. It's not a qualification or anything. And there is a hurdle requirement that you complete all of the weekly quizzes before you start the course exam. The exam consists of 40 multiple choice questions, which will have 1 hour to complete. Please note that the exam can only be attempted once, unlike the other quizzes, and it is open book, so you can save your progress. The 1 hour you have, though, it's a countdown timer that can't be stopped once it's begun. Therefore, do not attempt the exam until you are certain you are ready, or as ready as you're likely to get. We'll send you a reminder email, and if you do have any technical difficulties, please email us at shortcourses@itmasters.edu as soon as possible. And there's lots more information on the learn.itmasters.edu.au page, at the course page, under how do I qualify for a certificate in the frequently asked questions. As Brenton was alluding to, once you've completed the course, we would really appreciate if you took a couple extra minutes to complete the course satisfaction survey and a Zoom feedback survey, or not a Zoom feedback survey, a Produco feedback survey, sorry. Both found at the bottom of the IT Masters course page underneath the course content. The quiz just contains a few questions related to the short course, takes only a couple of minutes, and your answers are anonymous, of course. All of the exam information can be found at the course page, so if you've missed any of that, it'll all be available there. I guess all that is left for me to say is thank you, Brenton, for another great short course. The feedback has been fantastic already. It's always a pleasure working with you, and thank you to all of you listening along. It's been a nice course.
It's always my pleasure. I love doing this stuff. I really do enjoy it, and I really do value the feedback that everyone. I mean, it's great to know that the stuff that we do here is valuable and useful to you. So that is really good feedback for us. It's encouraging, it's motivating, and it also helps us fine tune how we go about it. I'll answer the question from Denali. The question about if you go into recovery mode and you're examining things, could it be that you actually terminate at that point? Well, absolutely. I mean, the first stage of recovery mode is to say, how bad is it really? And should we go into recovery mode? Because the other alternatives are we just keep going and keep hoping, or maybe we terminate it then. And yes, there is that decision that takes place at the beginning when we're exploring recovery mode and say, well, hey, we could go one of three ways here: status quo, recovery, or termination of some kind. If you go recovery, then you're saying, well, we think we can fix it, but we're not sure. Termination is still a possibility later. And that's why you've already had a lot of the discussions and checking about, well, what would termination look like? When would it? What's the thresholds? Because you've already had some of that conversation, it's a bit easier a second time if you have to have it again.
Alrighty, just Gominder's asked about the time frame for the exam. That the exams nowadays are open in perpetuity, so that people that come later to the course can still qualify for a course certificate. The only difference for people that have participated during the course delivery is that those who have posted in the weekly discussion forums are eligible for bonus points. Good posts get bonus points. It doesn't affect the exam mark is just cream on top. Then you get a slightly higher course mark if you posted in forums. Weekly quizzes are found in each module, and they're just underneath the discussion forums. For the person that asked that, I've deleted that one already. And just a quick note, Brenton, as you're the host, when you come to finishing and wrapping up, if you could press end meeting, because I can't do that as co-host. But
okay,
yeah,
all right.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all of your questions, your input, your contributions along the way. Thanks for all the forum posts, and I look forward to seeing many of you at the next short course. Until then, that's all from us for now. Thank you and goodbye.